Welcome back, fellow cardboarders. It was about time that I finally made this video. After a new record high of 54 voters voted for our next unique commander deck to build, the vast majority voted for a revisited trap deck, this time in Junt colors. So again, thank you everyone for voting, thank you for those wonderful ideas, and thanks for MationLong7907 for being responsible for this video being created right now. If you want your unique deck idea featured in the next commander vote and being responsible for the next unique deck tech, leave your unique deck ideas in the comments below and keep a lookout for the latest commander vote in our community tab. But now, enough with the intro, let's start our beloved segment of Think outside the deck box. Let's first look at our two commanders. We have Vial Smasher the Fierce here for 1, a black and a red, a legendary Goblin Berserker. Whenever you cast your first spell, each turn choose an opponent at random, and she deals an amount of damage to that random opponent equal to the converted mana cost. Most of the time we're going to do that. She can also hit Planeswalkers, but this is not what we are here for. She also has Partner, which we are going to use and add a third color. Animation Long suggested Gilanra, Caller of Wirewood. For 2 colorless and a green, it's a legendary elf druid who taps for 1 green, and when you spend this mana to cast a spell with CMC 6 or higher, you also draw a card. She's a 1/2 and also has Partner. So the idea of this deck is to play high CMC spells, throw them at random opponents' faces, and also draw cards from time to time with our second commander. As I already teased in the intro, this isn't the first time I've built a trap deck. I actually have a Krark and Vial Smasher Rakdos traps deck video already on the channel. If you're interested in a more chaotic variant, check out that video after this one. The wonderful thing about traps is that most of them cost a whole bunch of mana, but can be reduced when certain requirements are met. Now, the burning question that you probably already have is, are there enough traps card in existence that we can build a whole traps deck around it? And yes, there are. Let's first look at some OG traps and see why I included them. With the Bailoff Cage Trap for 3 and double green, and the requirement for it to become a little cheaper, so instead 1 and a green, is that an opponent had an artifact enter their battlefield this turn. And this is easily met with treasures, clues, and food tokens being created pretty much every turn. Don't forget mana rocks and artifact heavy decks generally. This card should cost only 2 mana most of the time, and we create a simple 4/4 beast token. But that's not all. If we use the mana from Gilanra, we can also draw a card, and we're gonna fling 5 damage at a random player with Vial Smasher, even though we only paid 2 mana for it. And this theme continues for the other traps. We have, for example, Cobra Trap, which deals 6 damage with Vial Smasher on the field, can only cost 1 green if any opponent destroyed one of our non-creature permanents. And then we put 4 1/1 green snake tokens onto the battlefield. The Lava Ball Trap costs 8 or 5 if an opponent ramped at any of their turns. Then we destroy 2 lands and deal 4 damage to each creature, so this is also kind of a board wipe, which will often also take our commanders, but don't worry, we have recursion and ways to protect our commanders. But yeah, most of the time this is a board wipe, so keep that in mind. Needlebite Trap. It's a trap! Another one that is beautiful. It deals 7 damage with Vial Smasher on the field, only costs 1 black if any opponent just gained a single life or more. And then we drain 5 life and gain another 5 from target opponent. It doesn't even have to be the life gaining opponent, so you can choose any one player, anyone you want. Nemesis Trap. If a white creature is attacking, this can also be used politically, so it doesn't have to be attacking you. You can pay 2 black instead of 6 mana to cast the spell, and you exile an attacking creature and copy it and exile it at the beginning of the end step. So this can also save a player if you want to, but you can also obviously use it when you're attacked by any white creature. It can also be multicolor, obviously, and you can remove any attacking creature, create a copy, and also block with it. So this can be used in so many ways. You can also use some ETBs if there are any. Very unique trap in my eyes, and very unique card in general. Ravenous Trap exiles all cards from target player's library, and it can also only cost 0 if an opponent had 3 or more cards put into their graveyard. Also very easy and happens quite often. And then we just exile their graveyard. Stone Idol Trap. I actually don't have this in my Krark and Vial Smasher deck. I think just because I don't have it, and I guess I lost it out of sight at some point. So yeah, I would include that in both decks. This can deal 6 damage with Vial Smasher on the battlefield, obviously. It costs 1 less for each attacking creature. Again, they don't have to attack you. So this can only cost 1 red. And then you create a 6/12 construct token with Trample. So you obviously can't use it to attack yourself, but it's great for blocking. And at the beginning of your end step, you have to exile it. I actually don't know why it has Trample. Like, if you're attacking, you can obviously create it, but it's not attacking as well, and you can't declare it as an attacker. So if you have like extra combat steps, I guess you can use the Trample, but it's kind of weird. But oh well, what can you do? Lastly, we have the Summoning Trap, which can cost 0 if a spell of yours was countered this turn. And then you look at the top 7 cards and put any creature from among them onto the battlefield. And we have some big beaters in our deck, since we want them to cost a lot of mana to deal heavy damage to our opponents with Vial Smasher. But wait, we are not finished yet. These were all the original OG traps from the Zendikar block back then, and there are actually several more cards which I would put into the trap category. They all have in common that they're instant speed and have a cost reduction in some way. Most of the time they also have to meet some requirements. So for example, let's first of all look at the Ancient Stone Idol, which is a hint at the Stone Idol trap. It's a creature with Flash, costs 10 mana as a 12/12 trample creature, and has the same effect as the Stone Idol trap, meaning it costs 1 less for each attacking creature. So these can be your attacking creatures, your opponents, and they don't have to be attacking you in any way. And it costs less. It can cost you 0 mana if there are like 10 creatures, 10 tokens, whatever, attacking anyone. And then you have a 12/12 blocker or attacker for later, and when it dies you create another 6/12 construct trample artifact creature token. And imagine casting this for 0 mana and dealing 10 damage to an opponent at random. Next up, another very expensive card from the Warhammer block, which is the Blood for the Blood God, which has a CMC of 11 and costs 1 less for each creature that died this turn. So if someone played a board wipe, you can even play it for just 3 mana, and it deals 8 damage to each opponent, and you discard your hand and draw 8 new cards, and then you exile the spell. And this I really love because it just resets your hand. Maybe you're almost out of gas and you just have 1 or 2 cards left and you just want to reset your hand, but also it deals 8 damage to each opponent. So in this case, it's not even important that your Vial Smasher is out, since most of the time, if you don't pay the 11, your Vial Smasher probably died because of a board wipe, since it deals 8 damage to each opponent itself. But if your Vial Smasher is out and this is the first spell, it's an instant, you can deal another 11 damage to a random opponent. Now, Bolt Bend is another card that costs less. If you control a thick creature, aka 4 power or greater, this costs only 1 red, and you change the target of a single spell or ability that has a single target. And this can be used for any spot removal, like imagine a Generous Gift trying to remove any of your important pieces, and you just change the target to some of their pieces. So very versatile, and no one will see it coming. Another way to reduce the mana cost of your spells is Delve, and we have a couple of those in the deck as well. This is also an instant and costs 6, so 5 and a black. It has Delve. We can just remove cards we don't need anymore from our graveyard to reduce the costs, and then just simply destroy a non-green creature that can't be regenerated anymore. Now, one of our first instant board wipes here is the Delayed Blast Fireball. I have a whole video about that from way back, I think 1 or 2 years ago almost, which talks about the beauty of this card, since you can foretell it for 2. If you don't, you just deal 2 damage to each opponent and each of their creatures, which is useful for just 3 mana. But if you foretell it and later cast it for 6 at instant speed, you deal 5 damage to each opponent and each of their creatures. So in some way, this is kind of a card similar to Cyclonic Rift, but in red, because it wipes the board of your opponent. And you deal 3 damage at a random opponent, but another 5 damage at each of your opponents as well. So keep that in mind and use it wisely. We have a second foretell card in our deck, which we'll see in a second, so your opponent won't always know which card it is, even if they know your deck. The Electrodominance I put also here into the trap category, even though it does not have a mana reduction, but it does cast a card for free. And this can be a trap then again. And you'd also deal X amount of damage plus the 2 red with your Vial Smasher at an opponent. Additionally to the X damage that you also deal at any target, probably an opponent. So this is a wonderful card to also deal a ton of damage, while also getting something for free. Force of Vigor can be cast for free by exiling another green card from your hand. Any trap maybe you don't need, or any other green card that you just don't need, just exile it and destroy up to 2 artifacts and or enchantments. Next up is our next Foretell card, which is the Green Slime, and we officially have the blessing of Gavin Verhey to say you've activated my trap card when you flip this card over. So Green Slime is a 3 mana 2/2 with flash, and when it enters the battlefield you counter target activated or triggered ability from an artifact or enchantment source, and if you counter such an ability you destroy that permanent afterwards. And it also has Foretell, so you can cast it for just a simple green mana. And man, I have destroyed a turn 1 Sol Ring with this card.
You triggered my trap card! Power balance!
They were not pleased. I think they even quit the game just after round 1. So yeah, keep it in your deck. It's a wonderful removal and you're gonna make a bunch of friends with it. We've got our first MDFC here. Kazul's Fury for 3 mana, 2 and a red, which does not have a cost reduction, but we also have to sacrifice a creature to cast the spell. But in my eyes, most of the time we're gonna use this card on its front when an opponent casts a board wipe and we're gonna lose one of our more thicker, powerful creatures like the Ancient Stone Idol, for example. And then they kind of activated like our trap card, forcing us to throw one of our creatures at any target, most of the time at a player. Pyrokinesis at first glance looks like an underwhelming card, but don't underestimate the 6 damage that you're gonna deal at instant speed for just a simple red card exiled from our hand. And then we can also deal 4 damage divided among any of our opponent's creatures. So in my eyes, a solid card to get some stuff out of the way. Speaking of getting stuff out of the way, Snuff Out. If we control a swamp and we're also playing Urborg, you can just pay 4 life instead of casting the mana cost of this spell and destroy a non-black creature which can't be regenerated. Next up, Spinning Darkness, one of my favorite commons from Weatherlight, which allows us to cast it for free if we exile the top 3 black cards from our graveyard, so we're not allowed to shuffle our graveyard. Generally ever as a rule, but most of the time if we're honest, we're going to do that, but in this deck we have to look out for not shuffling our graveyard. And then it deals 3 damage to a non-black creature and we gain 3 life. Next up, let's move into our removal category. Normally in my decks I have the rule of thumb of adding like 10 cards of card draw removal and ramp. And as you've seen, most of the trap cards are already removing stuff in the one way or the other, so reaching the 10 or even higher was no problem with this deck. And you'll see in the upcoming categories. And generally in this deck, the CMC of this deck is quite high, but most of the expensive cards have some cost reduction options in the one way or the other. So we have Avatar of Woe here. For 8 mana, it's a 6/5 with Fear, but it can also cost you only 2 black if there are 10 or more creature cards in all graveyards combined, and that shouldn't be too hard to achieve. The wonderful thing about the Avatar is that it can just tap and simply kill a creature which can't be regenerated, and we can do that every turn. Next up, 2 board wipes. We have the Black Sun's Zenith and the Blasphemous Act. Both of them can deal a whole bunch of damage with Vial Smasher, since our commander also sees the X as the converted mana costs, and this is just a simple board wipe for X and 2 black. We are putting X -1/-1 counters onto each creature and then shuffle it back into our library. And I really like this board wipe since this can also deal with indestructible creatures if we really have a problem with those from our opponents. Blasphemous Act most of the time will cost us a single red mana and deals 13 damage to each creature. Foundation Breaker could be put into the trap category as well, since it does have a cost reduction, but it didn't have the ability to be put out at instant speed. So I put him just simply at removal, and when it enters, we may destroy an artifact or enchantment. Similarly here, Fury, we can exile a red card to play it for free. It has double strike, and when it enters, we deal 4 damage among any number of creatures and or planeswalkers. Keep in mind, Evoke, we have to sacrifice it after we evoked it, but because of the cost reduction, it's just wonderful, and we're also going to deal some damage with Vial Smasher. 2 more Evokers here, Ingature for 5 or evoke 1 red. We destroy an artifact, and Shriek Maw for 5 or just 2 mana to evoke it. It's a creature with Fear, and it destroys a non-artifact, non-black creature when it enters. Lastly, we have Tassigur's Cruelty, which also has Delve. It can only cost a single black mana, and forces our opponents to all discard 2 cards, which can be devastating. Next up, Ramp. I also included some more expensive ramp cards like the Avatar of Growth, which most of the time will only cost us 3 mana, but deals 6 damage with Vial Smasher and is a nice group hug card, allowing everyone to get 2 more basic lands onto their battlefields. Black Market, whenever a creature dies, we put a counter on it, a charge counter, and at our pre-combat main phase we're gonna get 1 black mana per counter on this enchantment into our mana pool. So this can stack up nicely, especially after a board wipe, and should give us like 10-20 mana per turn easily. Crop rotation is mostly here to turn our boring lands into more exciting lands like Yavimaya or Urborg or Cabal Coffers, since those just fix our mana or generate a whole bunch more. Farseek for fixing our mana. This most of the time will fetch us a dual land or a triome, since our deck will be quite pip greedy. Mana Geyser adds 1 red mana per tapped land of our opponent, so this also easily creates 10-20 mana to use. Wonderful card, and also deals 5 damage with Vial Smasher. Nature's Lore, classic color fixing, same effect with 3 visits. More interesting is the Rousing Refrain, which adds 1 red mana per card in one opponent's hand, and we don't lose mana as we go through our phases until end of turn. And then we exile this card with 3 time counters on it. You can also suspend it for just 2 mana, and after 3 turns it comes back. And I found this really interesting because every 3 turns we're gonna deal 5 damage without question while Vial Smasher is on the field. And we're also adding mana to our mana pool. So I really like this card. Shadow in the Warp, another Warhammer card that reduces our first creature spell cost by 2 colorless for each turn. Keep that in mind if we have flash in our creatures, also very useful. And each first non-creature spell of our opponents will deal 2 damage to that player, so more damage is always better. Lastly, Great Henge, usual staple, but especially nice in this deck since this will deal another 9 damage to our opponents, and most of the time only cost like 2 green mana. It adds 2 green and gains us 2 life, and makes our creatures bigger when they enter, and also drawing us a card for each creature entering that is not a token. Next up, card draw. Since many of the cards in our deck have a mana value of 5 or more, we are gonna draw a whole bunch of cards with Up the Beanstalk. Even though this card was banned recently in Modern, it's still legal in Commander and does a lot of heavy lifting in our deck. Twilight Prophet, another card that gives us a card for free by revealing the top card of our library, but we also deal X damage and drain X life if we have the City's Blessing, equal to the mana value of the card we just revealed. And keep in mind, our deck is expensive in regards to mana value, so we are gonna deal an average of like 3-4 damage every turn with this one. Then we're gonna put this card into our hand and draw our normal card per turn. Return of the Wild Speaker, just because we have some thick creatures we can just draw cards for 5 mana. The second effect we're probably never playing. Protection Racket is another wonderful card similar to the Twilight Prophet, and this I urge you to try out in any non-combo decks like this one, since when you exile the combo pieces it's not as fun for you anymore, but generally this card does wonders, especially when you deal a whole bunch of damage. So at the beginning of your upkeep, for each opponent you reveal the top card of your library, and they choose to either get damage dealt equal to the mana value of the card you just revealed, and then they exile it, or you put it into your hand, and most of the time they will say that you get it into your hand since you revealed a expensive spell. Most of the time this does not draw you lands, only if you have friends at the table or do some politicking. Now a Lord of the Rings card here, the legendary artifact, also a wonderful inclusion in any non-combo decks. At the beginning of your end step you put an influence counter on it, scry 2, and then an opponent may have you draw a card. So you choose an opponent, probably the one that has the least amount of life. And if the player does not let you draw a card, you mill X cards equal to the number of influence counters, and that player loses life equal to the total amount of mana value that you just revealed. So this can be brutal. Most of the time they will let you draw a card. We will have a lot of mana left open throughout the turns, so why not use it with Mind's Eye to draw a card for just 1 colorless mana whenever an opponent draws a card. Very useful. Keen Duelist is another card that reveals the top card at our upkeep together with an opponent that we choose, and both get dealt damage equal to the amount of mana value that they revealed, but they deal it to the other player. So you deal the mana value that you revealed from your library and vice versa, and then you both put it into your hand. Baneful Omen is a mana-intensive enchantment that lets you reveal the top card of your library at each of your end step, and each opponent loses life equal to the mana value of the revealed card. And lastly, we have another MDFC, which we are most of the time going to play on its front side, since it will just replace itself with the best card in our graveyard. Now in the damage category, I put some cards that are just simply mana intensive and or just deal damage, like the Volcanic Salvo for 12 mana, which is a sorcery but can cost less, equal to the total amount of power I have on the board at any time. And then it deals 6 damage to each up to 2 creatures and or planeswalkers. So this deals 12 damage with Vial Smasher and can cost only 2 mana, while dealing another 12 damage to creatures and or planeswalkers. We have the Protector Guy that can cost less for each creature our opponents control, and then put some +1/+1 counters on our creatures. We have Galta in here as well. That's a 12/12 trample and can cost less, equal to the total power we have on the board. Similarly, the Incinerator costs 1 less for the amount of non-combat damage that we dealt this turn, and then deals the amount of non-combat damage to a creature or planeswalker that we dealt to a player as well. I also put in here Vedalken Orrery, which might be confusing at first, since this just simply gives you flash for all your spells. But keep in mind that with this thing out, we can actually flash creatures, sorceries, enchantments during our opponent's turns when we don't have any instance or don't want to cast any instance, but for example could put out a Galta during an opponent's attack step, having a free blocker and dealing 12 damage during an opponent's turn with Vial Smasher. So keep that in mind. That's why I put it into this category. Painful Quandary lets an opponent lose 5 life or have them discard a card per spell they cast. A very mean card. Maddening Hex also punishes the enchanted opponent whenever they cast a non-creature spell by having them dealt d6 damage, and then it enchants another one of your opponents. Another Lord of the Rings card is Call Forth the Tempest. For 8 mana, it has Cascade, and then it deals damage to each creature your opponents control equal to the mana value. So it's like Damage Storm. So keep track of that before you cast this spell. So this is another one-sided board wipe, similar to the Delayed Blast Fireball, and I just find it very neat. Lastly, in the damage category, we have the Choice of Damnations, which is a card not many people know about. It costs 6, and target opponent chooses a number, and you either have that player lose that much life or sacrifice all but that many permanents. So imagine a player having like 20 cards on their field, including lands, and they choose maybe like 10 or 12, and either you let them lose 10, 12 life points, whatever they chose, or they have to sacrifice like 10, 8 cards on their board. And keep in mind, with Vial Smasher we also dealt another 6 damage, so this one can be quite brutal. Before we look at the lands, some free stuff. We have the Capricious Hellraiser, which only costs us 3 red if we have 9 or more cards in our graveyard. It has flying and exiles 3 cards at random from our graveyard, and one of them we may copy for free. In the most recent set, they are blessing us with another Refrain kind of card, the Charnel Serenade, which costs 6 or has Suspend 3 for 3. Surveil 3, and then we return a creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter. So if it would die, we exile it instead, and then it gets 3 counters and 3 time counters, and we exile it again, allowing us to recast it after 3 turns. And with Vial Smasher we deal another 6 damage every 3 turns. So this can, for example, also reanimate one of our commanders, or just a very expensive creature that we don't mind to exile if it ever dies again. The Dragon Cultist, most of the time with Vial Smasher out, will give us a 4/4 flying red dragon at each of our end step. Very useful in my eyes. Fevered Suspicion has Rebound, so this will deal 8 damage twice, and also allow us to cast the top card from our opponent's libraries. The last MDFC is the Malaki Rebirth, which can save one of our more cherished creatures or one of our commanders. If we're desperate, we're gonna play it on the backside as a land. I do like the chaos aspect of this deck as well. Here we can put in Possibility Storm, casting some card for its cheaper alternative costs, and getting out some bigger, scarier card, and adding some chaos to this fun trap deck. Lastly, I'm playing Seedborn Muse with Gilanra. We can now draw a card every single turn, but with Vedalken Orrery out, this card is just bonkers. Now lastly, before we look at the lands, I hope you enjoyed this video. Do consider liking, subscribing, following me on all the socials. But now let's finish this video by looking at the land base. I'm playing 35 lands in total. That is 4 of each basic land that we can play: Forest, Mountain, and Swamp. I'm playing the whole cycle of Shocklands and Fetches. I'm playing the Triome, Urborg, and Yavimaya, as well as Cowl Coffers. If you want, you can also include the OG dual lands, but they are obviously replaceable with any other fetchable dual lands that enter tapped if you want to. I'm playing the Onslaught Cycling Cycle, since sometimes we will have too many lands and the option to just replace the card with the next card in our deck might be useful. Sometimes we have mana left over during the last opponent's turn, and we might just want to put it into replacing one of our lands. Other than that, we're playing Ancient Tomb, Bojuka Bog to have another Graveyard Hate card here, Command Tower, Boziju as a possible removal, Zokenzan for some surprise goblins, Takenuma for big bad creature from our graveyard, and lastly Witch's Clinic for Vial Smasher to gain lifelink and get her start draining life instead of just dealing damage. But now I do want to hear from you. What are some cards that I forgot to include? Let us know in the comments below. Be on the lookout for the next commander vote. Surround yourself with good people. Give the left button a little boop and the right one for another awesome video. See you there and have a beautiful day. Bye bye.